From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Welcome back, David. Hope you're feeling better.
I'm feeling better. Looking forward to paying my taxes.
Yeah.
I am.
Really?
It's the most patriotic thing you can do.
Oh, stop sucking up to Ralph.
No, he's reverberating off Oliver Wendell Holmes, which he said taxes are the price we pay for civilization. Remember, in the 1930s.
You're asking me if I remember.
Yeah. You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes also said of my family, one generation of imbeciles is enough.
Now, you always look at the dark side, don't you?
That voice you hear is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is going to be a great program on the IRS by the former head of the IRS. Listen carefully, people.
That's right. Tax day is almost upon us. And as we know, it's a time when chestnuts roast on an open fire and Jack Frost nips at your nose. Wait a minute, that's Christmas. Most people think of tax day as the time when your paycheck rests on an open fire and Jack Frost gets audited. What I'm trying to say is that it's not everyone's favorite time of year, and the IRS is not everyone's favorite government agency. But without the IRS and the tax system, we would be a third world country with no infrastructure, no public parks, no government services, and no national defense for that matter. It is one of the most important, if not the most important agency of the federal government. Regular listeners know that Ralph has often talked about how the Internal Revenue Service's budget has been gutted in recent years, resulting in millions, if not billions, of uncollected tax dollars. This money is vital to keeping the country running in all phases. Not surprisingly, the current occupant of the White House is not a big fan, having been audited on numerous occasions. And Senator Ted Cruz, when he was running for president, campaigned on abolishing the agency altogether. Well, as Ralph mentioned, our guest today is the former commissioner of the IRS, John Koskinen, who was nominated and confirmed during the Obama administration, in large part to help clean up a controversy over the IRS's alleged targeting of conservative groups. Mr. Koskinen soon after became a target of congressional Republicans himself in what has turned into an intensely partisan fight over the role and reach of the Internal Revenue Service. So I'm looking forward to his take on all of this. Also looking forward, as always, to hearing from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And in the second half of the show, we will be devoted to working our way through more of your listener questions. And I have to say, we have some tough ones on the docket. But first, let's introduce our guest, David.
John Koskinen was the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service for 4 years, from late 2013 to late 2017. As commissioner, Mr. Koskinen presided over the nation's tax system, which collects approximately $3.3 trillion a year in tax revenue, and it funds most government operations and public services. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, John Koskinen.
I'm delighted to be here.
Welcome indeed, John. I can call you by your first name because I first met you over 45 years ago when you were a staff director with Senator Ribicoff subcommittee overseeing the federal government. And I don't mind saying that you are one of the great managers of our time because you have the right personality, the knowledge, the ability to get feedback from the bottom up of all these large organizations that you've had to manage both in government, right down to the District of Columbia, I might add, as well as in the corporate world. So today, I'd like to provide a treat for our listeners, engaging in the usual stereotypes and mindless blasting of the IRS or eliminating the IRS, which have dominated the headlines and the news programs. I want people to know what the IRS does for them, to them, and should do by them. So let's start with some vital statistics, John Koskinen. Tell us about the budget of the IRS, the number of employees, where its offices are here and around the world, how much it collects, and as a footnote, what part of the revenue does the federal government get that it doesn't collect?
Well, that's a lot of questions. Let me see if I can answer most of them. The IRS has been under, as noted in the introduction, significant amount of budget cutting over the last 7 to 8 years, so that the budget now at about $11 billion, a little over $11 billion, is almost $1 billion lower than it was in 2010, 8 years ago, even though we've got 10 million more taxpayers and now a new set of tax rules that have been just passed by the Congress. So the net result, since over 70% of the budget is personnel, is the way the agency has been forced to deal with the budget cuts is simply not replace people as they leave. So the number of people has declined by about 20,000 since 2010. So we're down to about 80,000 dedicated people working for the IRS. There are about 500 offices around the country, although over 80%, closer to 90% of people file their returns now electronically and don't mail them into one of those many offices around the country. As noted, we collect, I've got to quit saying we, the IRS, where I used to work, collects a little over $3.3 trillion a year. That's over 90% of the funding of the entire government as we go. We do a review on an ongoing rolling basis to look at the rate of non-compliance. And the estimates are that the tax gap, as it's called, is in the range of about $450 billion. But I used to always stress that that doesn't mean that if we had a lot more people, we'd collect all of that $450 billion, because a lot of it represents uncollectible accounts, issues that no one would ever pursue. But it still is important to note that as a result of the decline in the number of employees, particularly those who work on enforcement, revenue agents, revenue officers, criminal investigators, the audit rate at the IRS is down significantly, almost 50% from where it was 8 to 10 years ago. Now, on the one hand, the listeners may think, well, that's pretty good. I've got a lower chance of being audited. But the risk is that that means we're going to not collect even more money. My estimate while I was there was we were missing about $8 billion a year as a result simply of not having enough people. And this wasn't a guess. These were audits that ought to have been done that weren't being done. And that $8 billion a year would fund a lot of government programs or help reduce the government deficit, which is a significant challenge, obviously, for the country. So while we're moving and worried about the enforcement side of the equation, it's important not just for the money that's collected, but it's important because a large number of people pay their taxes first because they do feel it's a citizen's obligation, as noted, it's the price we pay for a civilized society, but they also pay because they think everybody else is paying, and it's a fair system. And if people begin to suspect or worry that they're the only ones paying and their neighbors aren't paying or people are cutting corners, it doesn't take long for the compliance rate to drop. If you drop 1%, it costs you $33 billion a year, and you'll never catch it at 1%. And over time, it doesn't take long for you to begin to look a lot more like Greece and Italy in terms of tax non-compliance. So the enforcement side of the agency is important. But I think it's important for your listeners to understand that a significant part of that $11 billion is spent trying to help taxpayers figure out what they owe and how to pay it. We have thousands of employees who answer the phone, not enough of them to answer it as quickly as we'd like. But as I used to stress when I was making talks, if you're trying to be compliant and you have a problem, you don't have to hire somebody off late-night TV to contact the IRS. The IRS is interested in helping you become compliant. There are easy ways to have installment agreements. There are offers in compromise if it's really impossible for you to meet your debt. Because, again, the agency is trying to give you a clean start and make sure that on a regular basis you can be compliant and meet your tax obligations.
I know you're trying to get more online connection between taxpayers and the IRS, but for those Americans who are not online or who can't get their answers online, it's been a maddening experience of waiting 30 minutes, 40, an hour, 2 hours, never getting anybody, getting the wrong person. And that, you say, is partly or greatly due to the reduction in the number of overwhelmed IRS employees trying to answer the phones. How did you deal with that as Congress was slashing your budget because they had a vendetta against you on this alleged bias toward nonprofit conservative organizations?
Well, it was a challenge because obviously we have a significant concern about cybersecurity and protecting taxpayer data. We have an antiquated IT system that needed to be continually updated, so you had to make sure that you spent funding there. You had to worry about audit rates and enforcement, although, as noted, those numbers are down just because of the resource constraints. And you had to worry about taxpayer service. And taxpayer service is a critical element of what the IRS does, and nobody was more frustrated as we simply didn't have enough people on the phone than the IRS employees on the phone. When I used to
Oh, yeah, I was more frustrated because I get all these complaints. I was almost going to picket the IRS demanding that Congress increase your budget. That's how enormous frustration. How would you advise right now an individual taxpayer to contact the IRS to answer critical questions on a deadline?
Well, I think for everybody, I would say call the IRS general number. For those who are frustrated, now that I'm not in the government, I can say you should let your congressman know. One of the reasons that in 2016, for the first time, we got some additional money for taxpayer service was the level of service during the filing season for 2015 was abysmal. I had warned the Congress in appropriation hearings that if they kept cutting the budget, there was going to be no choice but to have lower enforcement and abysmal taxpayer service, and that resulted from the cuts that they imposed. So I think constituents have a significant amount of impact with their
sure.
Congress.
We'll get to that, John. But right now, just the practical tips on what can a taxpayer do trying to get through to an IRS employee to answer questions, and include that the role of the taxpayer advocate run for a number of years by the legendary Nina Olson.
Nina is kind of the ombudsman for taxpayers. She runs an independent operation that reports only to the commissioners, so she and I worked together closely the 4 years I was there, and she does a great job of being a kind of escape valve for people who just find that they've got complicated problems that can't be solved directly, and she and her office are delighted to help out with people. She gives an annual report to Congress about areas where the IRS could improve or Congress needs to provide more support. The lack of funding is always one of her highest concerns and priorities. And so she does a very good job for that, and is somebody that you can call if you've got a particular problem. If you're just having trouble getting through, you won't necessarily get ability for Nina to help you because she's actually dealing with people with specific problems. But she is a great resource for the commissioner. I always enjoyed working with her, even though we didn't always agree. But she actually represents taxpayers and tries to help work with the IRS to try to improve service wherever we can.
Now, how does a taxpayer get through? Let's say they're in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they can't get through to the IRS office in Cincinnati to answer time-pressured questions. Can they call Hartford, Connecticut? Can they call an IRS office in California to get through? Are there no tips?
Well, actually, the numbers when you dial do not go to a local office. In other words, because to try to avoid that problem, what you do is basically try to make sure that everybody's got an equal chance at being handled. So while we have phone services and phone centers around the country, the calls that come in go to the basic 1-800 number and then are routed accordingly to wherever we have services available. So you're not stuck if you're in Cincinnati, Des Moines, or Fresno calling the local office. What you're actually calling is the call centers, who will then try to directly answer your call and your question, or if they need to, give you directions as to what you need to do next. One of the things we found was that a lot of times people want to come in person and they call, and there's a number to call. And it turns out when they call, we started to set up appointments, and that turned out that half the people didn't need to come. They could get advice on the phone. And if they were going to set up an appointment, they could get a definite appointment, and we're told what to bring, as opposed to when I started, there used to be long lines because you couldn't get an appointment. You just had to go to the office. So anyway, if you're an individual, you just call our 1-800 number, which is 1-800-829-1040, oddly enough. That number, 829-1040, an 800 number, will take you into a call center, and that call center will actually give you the information to the extent they can, help you figure out exactly what information you need to provide, or if you need an appointment, allow you to make an appointment.
Of course, a lot of the questions taxpayers have used to be contained in the booklet that every taxpayer you got without having to ask every year. The 1040 booklet, for example, and many, many pages and instructions. And now you don't get that booklet in print. You're expected to go online. And what if you want the booklet in print? What do you do?
Well, the IRS, obviously with 150 million taxpayers, that was a fairly substantial expense. And since people were not using the forms that they got in the mail, they were, as I say, almost 90% filing online. What happens is you can get them online, or you can get them often at your local library. We have the IRS has working relationships with libraries around the country, where either the library will have the copies or the library will download it for you if you don't have access to the internet. So if you need direct answers, your local library is a good place to go if you actually want the physical paper. Or you can go to one of the IRS offices, which will either have the materials for you or be able to download and give them to you.
And all the forms, too. Like there's one in Washington that has all the forms you can pick and choose and get them for your own purposes. Let's talk about large corporate tax returns and corporate produced revenue for the IRS. Over the years, the percentage of the amount of money the IRS collects that come from corporations has been declining, in part because Social Security and payroll taxes are cranked in. But around 1950-55, corporate taxes produced about 33% of federal revenue. Now it's down to 8, 7, sometimes 6%. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, as you note, what we've got is an increase in the number of individual taxpayers that has grown significantly, and the ratios add in payroll taxes like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, so that there's a significant amount of money comes simply from increased amount from individuals. But at the same time, there was a study out this week out of a group at Syracuse University noting that the audit rate for large corporations, even as the number of them goes up, the audit rate is dropping. And it's again the same equation, that there aren't enough revenue agents to be able to cover the largest corporations, and that's obviously where you have on an audit-by-audit basis the best returns. So while we don't advertise the numbers because they change over the course of time, if you are a wealthy individual or a large corporation, your chances of being audited are significantly higher than if you're just an average taxpayer.
John, let's talk about large corporations. One of the more notorious ones in terms of their cleverness at avoiding taxes is General Electric. And in the early 21st century, there were a number of years when General Electric made billions of dollars of U.S.-based profits and paid no federal income tax. When you are auditing these large corporations, they are so gigantic that you actually have IRS revenues in residence, don't you, at times? I mean, I'm not saying when you suspect evasion of the taxes and you have a special investigation, but just routinely, aren't there IRS agents in residence for companies like IBM, General Electric, Pfizer, GM?
Yes, there are large companies that are under what's called kind of continuous audits, and in fact, again, trying to become more efficient and look for the problems where they really are. For those corporations that have a history of compliance, there was a compliance program set up where the corporation and the IRS would actually jointly look for where the questionable issues were to make sure those were audited, and in exchange for that, the IRS would allow corporations to close their audits in time to close for their SEC filings, because the hardest thing for large corporations is to have several years of audits outstanding, and they have to reserve against those. So there was a program, again, on a kind of continuous audit basis to, in fact, try to focus on what are the significant issues. Now, again, as we move forward and with more data available, the large business part of the IRS is developing what they call campaign program, where instead of relying on a single corporate audit to find an issue, they are looking at issues that occur across the board in many corporations and using those campaigns to audit those corporations for those specific issues. And it's, again, a way to try to make sure that everybody's treated fairly so that the only people who pay that tax are and not just the people get audited, but everyone will, in effect, be under review for that. But basically, yeah, some of these corporations are so large and so global that much like the financial regulators, you end up spending kind of having people there regularly. You have to rotate those people because you don't want people going native. But you basically spend a lot of time doing it.
You know, David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning tax reporter when he worked at the New York Times, wrote a book called Perfectly Legal on all the ways that corporations can avoid taxes and not have to evade them illegally because of their lobbying for the kind of tax laws in Congress that they want. And he came to an interesting conclusion. He basically said we are now reaching a point where these giant global corporations can decide for themselves how much tax they pay, where they pay in the world, and when they pay in terms of calendar dates. Now, you think it's reached that point? I know you've tried to cooperate with a lot of foreign countries to stop what you think are unfair underpayment of taxes. through more uniformity, et cetera. Do you think that statement by David K. Johnson is true?
Well, as you know, David's done a lot of great work in this area. And I think we're clearly run the risk of moving in that direction. One of the biggest concerns was that corporations were, in effect, keeping all of their profits offshore that were generated there, and so you had trillions of dollars literally untaxed because they wouldn't be taxed until you brought them back. So part of the major goal, really, of the tax reform that passed was to put the U.S. tax system on a more equal basis with those around the world, so the corporations weren't encouraged to, in fact, leave a lot of money underinvested abroad and could bring that back and invest it here. But the tax code, one of the biggest, Senator Cruz and I didn't agree about a lot of things, but we both agreed, as a lot of people do, the tax code is just too complicated. There are too many loopholes, too many legitimate ways that particularly large corporations or wealthy individuals can avoid paying taxes legitimately. So the biggest issues aren't necessarily tax evasion, although there's a lot of that goes on. Biggest issues are that the tax code really needs to be simplified so that it's more transparent and everybody knows more easily what they owe and everybody knows what everybody's paying.
You use the word double non-taxation when you talk about global corporations. What do you mean by double non-taxation?
Well, part of the challenge, particularly in areas like intellectual property, where you have Google and Microsoft and others that are operating around the world, is what the OECD, with their base erosion profit shifting issue, has been concerned about, is that a corporation may say, I'm not operating for this purpose in country A, so you can't tax me there. I'm in country B, but in country B, because of the rules there, they're not paying any taxes either, so they've really got double non-taxation. They're not taxed in their home country. They're not taxed in the country where they're doing business. And obviously that's not fair to either country or the taxpayers within those countries. So globally, and you're right, we've worked cooperatively with the OECD. Globally, there's been a big move over the last 4 or 5 years to push back against, in effect, corporations, large corporations, being able to shift their revenues somewhat irrationally, not associated with where they're doing business, to a place where they can pay either no taxes or very low taxes. And a big part of that is what's called country-by-country reporting. And the OECD now and tax administrators around the world are requiring corporations to file information with all the countries that they deal with through their home country, showing where all their activities are around the world, so that everyone will be able to say, okay, here's a company, it's maybe a German company, and now for the first time you know exactly which countries their employees are, which countries they're doing business, and so the tax commissioners can work together both to avoid double non-taxation and then on the other side of the coin to avoid double taxation, which is also a challenging problem.
You know, most people don't know that under Wisconsin law until the 1960s, corporate tax returns filed with the state of Wisconsin were public. The argument was corporations are not people. People deserve privacy, but public corporations don't deserve that level of privacy. And if they're made public, more people of some skill and interest can scrutinize them and help the government enforce compliance against these corporations. And then the corporations lobbied in Madison, Wisconsin, and got rid of that law. But what do you think of that? What do you think above a certain size, these corporations operating globally with all kinds of subsidiaries, holding companies, shell corporations, tax shelters, the Grand Cayman Islands, the Luxembourg tax haven, etc. What do you think of making these corporate tax returns public so that your kind of job when you were at the IRS can be helped along with an enhanced right to know?
Well, the challenge as the world becomes more global, and virtually any large corporation is global one way or another, is that there are enough details in their tax returns that they are, in fact, competitive documents. And so one of the concerns with country-by-country reporting, which is starting this year, is by the companies and tax authorities, is to make sure that as that information is provided and there's greater transparency among tax authorities, that information isn't used negatively against a corporation by its competitors. So years ago, when there was less global competition and less focus on the increasingly complicated ways corporations do business, there was probably less concern about trade secrets, about operational strategies, etc. And so I think that would be the limitation. On the other hand, as I've said, I do think that there has to be, and that's where we're going, greater transparency globally about where corporations are operating. SEC filings already give people a pretty good idea what tax rates are and what uncertain tax positions are, so that it was never a secret that General Electric wasn't paying much taxes. You could look in their public filings. But to get into the details behind those complications and have them be public would give their competitors, a roadmap as to what they're up to and what they're planning. And so that would be the limitation.
Let me give you an example. You're probably familiar with this, but there was a controversy about 10, 12 years ago about whether the IRS form for corporate taxation should have a line asking the corporation to disclose any kind of commercial partnerships it had here and around the world. And there was a lot of lobbying on Capitol Hill to make sure that that piece of information was never asked for by the tax return. And the IRS wanted to ask that, but they were pressured by Congress. One of your predecessors testified before the Congress that the absence of that kind of information about partnerships cost the IRS $7 billion a year. There are some estimates that went as high as $25 billion. To what extent has that problem been resolved under your watch or before?
Well, that question still is not asked. Again, as we move forward, there's much more data available and for analytical purposes, and so there's a tremendous amount of data now, more data available to the IRS. What you're looking for is in a corporate entity or even for partnerships generally is to what businesses are you in, who are the people you're doing business with. If there's an issue, if you're reporting X, is the other company reporting X or is it reporting something else? So it's an audit trail that's helpful, but as I say, there's an increasing amount of data available. And particularly the SEC filings are increasingly transparent about what companies are, business they're in, where they're doing business, where they're getting their revenues from. So it has not been as big an obstacle as it might otherwise have been. As I say, I think, again, back to where we started, the biggest obstacle in auditing corporations and audits generally is just that there aren't enough revenue agents. No matter how efficient you are, if you lose, as the IRS has, close to 6,000 revenue agents, officers, and criminal investigators, you're clearly not going to be as effective, and you're not going to get the work done that needs to be done.
Which leads to my next question. You didn't particularly like this. The Congress was pressuring you to outsource by contract the dunning people for uncollected taxes. So commercial contractors will call taxpayers and say they represent the IRS, and they start beating up on the taxpayer to fork over the money. You never really liked that.
No, I always thought that it had been tried a couple times before and never turned out to work out very efficiently. And if you think about it, the private sector company has a profit margin that the government doesn't have. So by definition, it ought to be more efficient to have simply more people at the IRS doing that work than those in the private sector. It was done this time, oddly enough, to help fund the Highway Trust Fund. In the old days, we funded the Highway Trust Fund with gas taxes, which haven't gone up in 20 years, but Congress is in an anti-tax mode and decided, well, they wouldn't do that. They'd come up with these kind of odd ways of theoretically generating more money. So my commitment was that it hadn't worked before, but my commitment to the Congress was we would do everything we could to run the program efficiently, to try to see if we could make it work. Because I told everyone if it doesn't work, I wanted the data to be there to conclusively show either here's why it works or here's why it doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, we quit doing it every 5 or 10 years.
And the result?
Well, the result is we're in the IRS is in the second year of that. Thus far, the startup costs have overwhelmed the amount of money coming in, but that gets amortized over the next 3 or 4 years. And the data is being very carefully collected without a bias, either for or against. And I think in the next couple of years, 3 years, we'll see how much money it cost and how much money was generated. And it won't surprise me that it'll turn out to be, it would have been more efficient to just put the money into the IRS and hire more revenue agents.
A related question. We're talking with John Koskinen, who was head of the Internal Revenue Service from 2013 to 2017. You made great progress in reducing the level of identity theft and refund fraud. That was a remarkable performance. Can you talk about that and give us some idea of the quantity of identity theft and refund fraud?
Right. When I started, one of the intractable problems, actually potential growing problems, was the risk of identity theft. Criminals have all sorts of information now on everybody. Filing a return before you did, claiming a refund, which would go out, and then you'd file, and they would be told, well, your return's already been filed. And when I started, it would take a year to clear up your account. And we were sending out an estimated $5 to $6 billion a year in false refunds. We worked very hard for the first couple of years developing more sophisticated filters and IT systems, but about 3 years ago, it seemed to me that what we needed to do was to take another tack. And so I brought into Washington the CEOs of the major tax preparers, H&R Block, Intuit for TurboTax, the software developers, and the state and tax commissioners. And I brought them to Washington and I said, the purpose of this meeting is not for me to tell you what to do. The purpose is to form for the first time a real partnership with the private sector, the state authorities, and the IRS to work together, sharing information, spotting suspect returns and patterns of activity to deal with this. So the press in 2015 said, well, how much difference will it make? And I said, well, I don't know. We'll see. So at the end of the first year, the number of victims of identity theft had gone down by over 40%. The first time in 6 to 8 years we'd had any decline at all. We used to think we were holding our own, we were doing well. So then I thought, well, okay, we'll see the next year. We added more filters, more cooperation with the private sector and the states. And I thought, well, maybe it'll hopefully hold steady or go up a little, because sometimes when you have a big drop like that, the drop was another 40%. So in 2 years, thanks to that partnership and the hard work of the IT people and dedicated IRS employees, the number of victims of identity thefts went down by 2/3, which meant that last year, 2017, the number of victims of identity theft was lower by 500,000 taxpayers who otherwise would have been victims. And so, as I say, it's a great example. I've always found that, even when I was the Y2K czar, that the government, if it has a positive partnership with those who are working in the same area in the private sector, you can accomplish an amazing amount of things. And for taxpayers, we're still concerned about those who are victims, but the number of victims, as I say, is down by over about 2/3. And I think people can feel more comfortable that when they file their return, they're not going to be told, hey, somebody else has already filed your return. Now, some of your listeners may have had an inquiry from the IRS saying, was this your return? Because if it's suspicious, there'll be a call or a letter, basically a letter sent saying, we got a return, we want to make sure it's yours. And one of the ways we stopped identity theft was in a number of those occasions, large number, it wasn't the taxpayer's return, but our filters and our partnership had identified the return and held it. So the return didn't get processed, the refund didn't get paid, the taxpayer was not disadvantaged. At the same time, partially because the number of victims is going down, it now takes in the range of about 90 to 120 days to resolve your problem if you're one of the few remaining people who's a victim of identity theft. So during my 4 years, it was one of the great things the IRS was able to accomplish.
You know, just to elaborate that in terms of media and education of the public, did you have a chance to go on the media to talk the way you're talking now and informing the public as much as you would like? I mean, did you get on any of the Sunday talk shows? Did you get on NPR, PBS? Did you get on any of the networks or interview shows? Or didn't you want to be?
No, I was always available to the press. My theory was if somebody had a question whether or an issue, whether it was positive or negative, the best position for the IRS was to respond, and we had an obligation to answer any question people had. So I had over 40 hearings with the Congress. I was on a number of those talk shows or issues. I had press conferences. It's been a long time, I gather, since the IRS regularly had press conferences where sometimes we'd have 30 or 40 media representatives, and there the floor was open. My rule of thumb was there was no rule. You could ask anything you wanted. It was interesting. Years ago, a marketing guy told me, marketers know you have to make 7 impressions before anybody gets the message, which is why you see all those Volkswagen ads over and over.
Repetition.
Repetition. We talked about these numbers, which were stunning. Every time I would talk to a congressman or senator and explain where we were with identity theft, their eyes would get wide and they'd say, wow, that's amazing. And what's stunning to me is after a couple of years, they were still saying that, which meant that no matter how often you said it, people still didn't understand and hadn't grasped the good news. Now, it's partially because everybody pays attention to bad news, not good news. But it is an interesting phenomenon that trying to get the message out and the information out is a big part of what I think being the commissioner is you've got to keep reminding people, here's the problem, here's what we're doing to solve it, here's the result.
On an issue of compliance, there's another aspect to it. You know, there's some people who just don't want to pay their taxes, period. But there are others who try to avoid paying their taxes. And you say, why? And they say, the government is so corrupt, it wastes so much money, it has so many wars around the world that shouldn't have. I don't want to be part of that, and that's why I'm not going to pay my taxes, or I want to minimize my taxes. Now, the poster man for that kind of argument, which certainly erodes compliance, is Donald Trump, because before he became president and he was campaigning, it became quite clear that he started bragging about paying very little taxes. And when he was hard-pressed by reporters, he said, why should I pay any taxes to Washington? It's so corrupt and wasteful. How do you deal with that sort of problem? Because that's a kind of self-justification or rationale that a lot of people have. And that's not under your control at the IRS. That's the rest of the government in terms of their need to become more efficient and use money properly for the right purpose and not for some vested interest.
Well, obviously, I can't talk about any individual taxpayer, including the president. But as a general matter, having spent 3 years as the Deputy Director for Management at OMB in the Clinton administration, I'm a big believer in government efficiency and effectiveness. And I think those are appropriate questions for people to raise. But for the tax protesters who say, I'm protesting either I don't like the policy or I don't like the government, first of all, those get audited and a number of them go to jail, and I think that's appropriate because, in effect, what they're doing is by not paying their fair share, they're loading that burden not just on other taxpayers today, they're increasing the government deficit and loading it on their children and their grandchildren. So, in effect, they're stealing money from their grandchildren and their children by saying, in a self-righteous way, well, I'm just not supporting the government. What they're doing is making someone else support the government, and that deficit's going to have to be paid by somebody. And if it's larger because of the non-payment by tax protesters, those protesters, in effect, are passing that burden on to those who don't have any choice.
But, you know, there are a small number of them that are extremely principled peace advocates, for example, and they just don't want to give any money to criminal wars of aggression, as they say, and they're willing to take the heat. In other words, it's sort of open civil disobedience that operates by these people. So a lot of the others just want to maneuver, of course, and it's not a matter of principle. But it is important for people to empathize with whoever is head of the IRS. So let me tell you one empathy that I shared with you without you knowing it, John Koskinen. I said to myself, when the press was insisting that Donald Trump do what other presidential candidates that year did and release the tax returns, and Hillary released her tax returns, I said to myself, John Koskinen must be sweating every day in the IRS, wondering whether anybody in this sprawling agency is going to leak those tax returns to the press. And it never happened. But were you sweating quietly?
Well, I wouldn't say I was sweating. I actually I talked to about over 25,000 of the 80,000 IRS employees in person in my tours, and came away with a great feeling of it's a remarkable workforce dedicated to its mission, and they know that one of their primary purposes is to protect the privacy of every taxpayer's information. We also, the IRS monitors anybody who looks at a tax return or accesses it, and if you don't have a good reason to do that, it's a fireable offense, and people are terminated. Usually they're looking for a relative or a friend, but you're not allowed to do that. You can't even look at your own unless you've got a reason to. So I did, though, worry that, okay, now this won't be good if somehow it comes out. And so the first thing that happened was it's the only time it happened, there was a report one morning that 2 pages of the return, the front 2 pages from the 2005 return of the president, had suddenly been made public. And I thought, well, now that's not a good sign. And then as I got to the office and got more information about it, the first page of that copy said client copy. And I thought, well, okay, good for us. So it was a tribute to the IRS that there were people offering hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for a copy of the president's return. And I thought it was a great tribute to all of those IRS employees who just thought that was far beyond the pale. Nobody was going to do that.
Well, part of it is a credit to you. You actually went out, you met and talked with over 20,000 IRS employees in the field. You had town meetings all over the country. I mean, nobody's ever done it like that. I mean, you have enormous management skills and the right personality to go along with it. By the way, over the years, the IRS has had real problems with their computers. And I've never been able to figure out why they can't ever catch up, and how much money was wasted by the IRS. Some of these computers go back to the time of President Kennedy. What's the problem there?
The problem is you have to understand the magnitude and the size of what we're talking about. This is, if not the largest, one of a handful of largest financial institutions in the world.
Mm-hmm.
When you start talking and processing every year 150 million individual tax returns from individuals, let alone another 30 or 40 from corporations and partnerships, the data processing and the flow is complicated. And then, as you note, the IRS has been in business for over 100 years and basically started with we have still programs, as you note, in not COBOL, in the predecessor to COBOL, assembler language. So we're having to train people how to in fact read the code that's there. And the problem with it is the system is running because the tax filing season ends for most people next week, but then you can get an extension into October, by which time we're all geared up trying to get to the next year. So it's the famous fix an airplane while it's flying. You can't simply shut the system down for 6 months or a year and replace it all. So they have made great progress. As I say, we're moving toward online accounts. As I said, we're not trying to go to the moon. The goal would be to give people the ability to deal with the IRS the way they do today with their financial institutions, mortgage companies, whoever, where you'd have a secure account and you could do transactions and get all the information you needed under a secure online account. So a tremendous amount of progress has been made. The ability to have over 200 filters to look for anomalies in tax returns, which has helped with identity theft, all are developments over the last several years, even with constrained resources. But, the Affordable Care Act was not funded for the IRS, so the IRS spent over $1 billion just doing the IT work to meet that statutory mandate. The theory, I think, on the Hill was, well, if we don't give them any money, maybe it'll all fall apart. I kept telling them we've got an obligation to do statutory mandates. One of the reasons that taxpayer service wasn't as good as it should have been was we didn't have a choice about doing the mandate, just as the IRS doesn't have a choice about implementing the tax law this year.
On that point, John Koskinen, former head of the IRS, whom we're interviewing today, what's the ideal budget right now that you think the IRS should have? It's at about $11 billion, which is used to collect over $3.3 trillion a year. What budget would you want for the IRS right now if you had your druthers?
If I had my druthers, it's about $11.2 billion. I would say as a start over 2 or 3 years, just to increase back to where we were 8 years ago. So I've always said we don't need to hire back. The IRS doesn't need to hire back another 20,000 people to get back to where they were because the IRS has become more efficient. But it's clearly 5 to 8 to 10,000 people short, particularly in enforcement and taxpayer service. But I think showing the efficiencies that have been built in, if you could actually in 2019 give the IRS the budget it had 9 years earlier, you would have a pretty good start toward appropriately funding the organization. So that $800 million more is, on the one hand, for all of us, a huge amount of money. But in terms of the amount of additional resources that would be collected, nobody's ever disagreed that the IRS will give you somewhere between 4 and 8 times back the money you give. So if the IRS over time could get $800 million more a year, at a minimum, the government would collect $3 to $4 billion a year more.
So that would be a budget a little over $12 billion a year, you're saying, in
right.
2019.
2019, and that budget would be the same as it was 9 years earlier. So there aren't a lot of things running these days with a budget at the same level it was 9 years ago. But I think the IRS is efficient enough and has made enough progress that would be a significant step forward.
Well, before we close, John Koskinen, anything you want to share with our listeners that we haven't discussed? Any reminiscence, any suggestions? What would you like to say?
Well, I think I would close, and I tried to, again, on the 7 impressions theory, get people to understand this is a truly dedicated workforce. It's career people. The only political appointee on the management side is the commissioner. So the deputy commissioners, all the agency heads are all senior executives, career people who have devoted their lives to the mission of the IRS. And as noted, when I went out and talked to all of these employees, I expected some of them would be complaining about, we don't have enough resources, my life is difficult. I never heard that. What I heard was we need more resources to help taxpayers. We need more resources to collect revenues that are owed to the government. And it was just refreshing and reassuring to see a group of people that dedicated to the work they were doing and to try to do it as well as they could. And as I say, a significant portion of that work is on behalf of taxpayers, trying to help them out. And I think if the public understood that, as you said at the start, nobody loves taxpayers, nobody loves paying taxes. It is the cost of a civilized society. But I think it is important for people to understand that people doing the work care about it greatly, care about the taxpayers, and are trying to do the best they can on behalf of both the government and on behalf of taxpayers.
And like any large organization, you're going to have some rogue elements. You're going to have some abusive tax collectors. You're going to have some incompetent IRS staff. And you made no bones about dismissing people like that.
No, that's correct. I mean, everybody always says, well, you never can fire anybody. The IRS dismisses a number of people, a small number in a percentage. But if you say, if anybody's abusive, exceeds their authority, and tries to intimidate people beyond just showing up, which may be intimidating, or particularly if they access impermissibly any accounts or records, those are grounds for dismissal. And in fact, every IRS employee is obligated to be current on their taxes.
I have a question that's burning about the National Rifle Association. I don't know if it's a 501c4 or a 501c3, maybe both. Is the IRS capable of looking into whether or not the National Rifle Association is actually entitled to a 501c4 and C3 status without it being politicized?
Well, the IRS has the authority to look into any tax-exempt organization to make sure they're complying with the statutes. Again, I can't talk about the NRA, and I don't really know. I assume there is 501c4, which is a social welfare organization. The people applying for the social welfare exemption were the ones that suddenly showed up en masse in 2010 and generated the confusion in the IRS, which led to significant delays, which should never have happened, but then triggered the issue while they were targeting conservative groups. As Ralph notes, it turned out the liberal groups were caught in the same maelstrom. It was a management mistake. It should never have happened, and we did everything we could to make sure it doesn't happen again.
That was before you came on.
And it all happened before I came on, but that didn't keep people from, roping me into it, which was fine. It came with the territory. If there's a concern, it is that any time you now look at a tax-exempt organization, people are going to say, well, are you targeting it or are you looking at it? And so there is a rule in the process across the IRS for individuals, corporations, tax-exempt, is no individual can trigger an audit. There are procedures for which organizations are looked at. They're reviewed. The recommendations are reviewed. Most of the individual audits are all done by algorithm. In other words, they're selected with the nature of what's in the return, not who the filer is. So everybody who's a 501c3 or a C4 is eligible to be reviewed. They all file 990 reports about their activities. Again, there aren't as many audits of those activities as there should be because, again, the number of people in that division are down by probably 25%.
Well, we're out of time, John Koskinen, but I know our listeners are thinking, we didn't cover this and we didn't cover that, and we'd love to have you on sometime in a few months to go over new ground based on your enormous experience in managing government agencies. Thank you very much, John Koskinen.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk a little about the IRS.
Thank you very much, John Koskinen.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with John Koskinen, former commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. We will link to his very impressive resume at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's take a minute and find out what's going on in the corporate crime arena with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 13, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The enormous and mostly unreviewable power that federal prosecutors exercise in a process dominated by settlements warrant ample skepticism about the motivations underlying what they choose to disclose and say. But it remains remarkable that there is so much more disclosure and speaking in the field of corporate crime than in any other area of federal prosecution. And that's a good thing, according to Samuel Buell, professor of law at Duke University School of Law and author of the newly released law review article, Why Do Prosecutors Say Anything? The Case of Corporate Crime. Professional self-interest and Washington politics may explain some of this behavior, but the effort to accomplish something programmatically likely explains more of it, Buell wrote. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. We have time for a few listener questions. And this one, Ralph, is a tough one. It comes from a listener named Eric Brooks. And the subject is, please undo your damage of greenwashing the Nature Conservancy. He's referring to our interview with Jack Dangerman, who he and his wife Laura conserved about 38 square miles of land in California. And what he said was, I was frankly shocked to hear you and your guest Jack Dangerman promoting the Nature Conservancy, which is a massively corporate-funded and run nonprofit, quote unquote, that helps greenwash and perpetuate the corporate rape of the planet in return for getting corporate money to create a few trophy conservancies. And he says, as a former PERG organizer, I expect better from the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. What do you have to say to that, Ralph?
Well, I don't think I was promoting the Nature Conservancy. It was just a matter of fact that Jack Dangerman chose the Nature Conservancy for this large tract of pristine land jutting into the Pacific Ocean from California. Why did he choose it? Because they do have those connections. In other words, they're a powerful preserver of land. They have had land exchanges with companies that have been criticized. They had one or two scandals in recent years, but they're powerful enough to make sure that that number of square miles are not going to be subjected 10, 20, 40 years from now to some development alternative. In other words, the language that Jack Dangerman insisted on with the Nature Conservancy is so specific that the power of the Nature Conservancy itself, unless they violate that language, can ward off any kind of developers or encroachments that could compromise that wilderness.
Isn't this an issue for a lot of environmental groups in terms of funding, that maybe some issues they will stay away from because of their sources of funding, even though they're doing good work in other areas?
Yeah, that's always a problem. I've had the view that corporate funding can come with strings attached. It can give bad appearances. I wouldn't say the Nature Conservancy is massively corporate funded. They have a lot of other sources of funding, foundations, etc. But it is true that corporations do try to taint these nonprofit groups, co-opt them, preempt them, infiltrate them, get on the boards of directors. And as the old saying goes, it requires eternal vigilance.
All right, David, take the next one.
Yeah, this is from somebody who didn't like your interview with Nassim Nicholas Taleb. It's from Gilbert Hall. He says, this is a disappointingly uncritical interview that you had, Ralph, about skin in the game. The email says Hitler had all his skin in the game in World War II, and Roosevelt didn't have any, in Europe at least. And he talks about Putin having no skin in the game in Syria, yet Taleb seems happy about his intervention. I would have liked some details about how Israelis and Palestinians will settle if there's no outside interference. It doesn't look easy to me.
It isn't an easy topic, Gilbert Hall. You make some very important points. The general principle is that if you have skin in the game, that you're going to behave more responsibly. Being part of the risk, you're part of the solution. However, there are a lot of aberrations to that. Corporate executives may have skin in the game so much for their compensation packages being based on stock options in the corporations they're running that they shove aside the use of corporate money and engage in stock buybacks instead of raising worker salaries, shoring up worker pensions, engaging R&D, productive investment, or, heaven forbid, give the money directly to the shareholders in the mutual and pension funds. So you're right to raise all these nuances, and it's very difficult to get all this in a short program, as you would see if you read his book, which a couple of weeks ago was number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, and then it fell down in the succeeding week to number 14. So it's a very intriguing subject. I'm glad you asked the question that way.
This question comes from Earl Ammerman IV, and he's referring to a Supreme Court case or some court case that's coming up called Janus versus AFSCME, and which is a union, AFSCME. I'm not quite sure what Janus is. Maybe you can tell us what that is. But his question is, does it seem that the Koch brothers and other conservative super PACs are using this court case as a way to prevent unions like AFSCME and super PACs aligned with the Democratic Party from using Citizens United in the same manner as the Koch brothers super PACs. And he's saying if the union loses this court case, does that mean that Citizens United needs to be reviewed again by the Supreme Court? And could that union argue that their own First Amendment rights were violated? Or if they lose that case by stating that they were only engaging in the same activities that are protected by Citizens United? Can you make head or tails of that question, Ralph?
Not really. I know what he's getting at. I mean, Citizens United opened the floodgates so corporations, as corporations, not executives of corporations, could give as much money as they wanted, no limits, to oppose or support candidates for local, state, and national office in our country. This labor case is designed to protect the alleged freedoms of workers who don't believe in what the union is doing or don't believe in being part of a union and avoid paying dues, even though they're working in a place where they're receiving the benefits of the union management agreement or contract. It's widely believed that the Supreme Court is going to come down against the unions by a vote of 5-4 very shortly. If that happens, the unions are going to have to find ways to get much closer to their rank and file. Last I heard, in Sweden, the unions do not have a checkoff system with the employer. The union steward actually has to go and collect the money from each worker. Well, that, of course, is maximizing accountability to the rank and file. I don't know if that's still the case, but that was the case over 10 years ago in Sweden. That is a nightmare for union leaders in this country. Imagine going every quarter or every month to the workers and asking them to pay up. That is what is at stake here. The political dimension behind this whole case is the Republicans want to weaken the public employee unions and other unions, and the Democrats want to defend the union status quo.
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you all for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Facebook page. I want to thank our guest again, former IRS Commissioner John Koskinen. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up.
Join us next week when we speak to Gail McLaughlin, former Green Party mayor, who's now running for Lieutenant Governor of California, and Professor Joshua Landis, who's going to help us dive deep into what exactly is going on in Syria. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you all. Gail McLaughlin has quite a story. She not only challenged injustice in the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California, which has a lot of low-income minority residents, but she actually became mayor and got things done.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where Ralph gives former IRS Commissioner John Koskinen an assignment, and David wonders if anyone will ever be able to get their hands on Donald Trump's tax returns.
When I met you before you became IRS Commissioner, I suggested that you read this book, Up the Organization, by Robert Townsend, who was a former president of Avis Rent-A-Car. And it was a little handbook on how to manage and how to get the most out of your staff and motivate them and make them feel good about themselves and who they're serving. Do you have a book in you like that?
Well, every time I finish one of my crazy jobs, like being the Y2K czar for the country and the world, or the IRS, or the deputy mayor and city administrator for Washington, people say, you should write a book. And historically, I said, well, I'm not sure. It's not my style to say, hey, look, ma, no hands. But I did tell people as I was nearing the end of my term, which is fixed by statute, that I've now accumulated enough stories that maybe it's time to write a book about my experiences, particularly the points you make about, I've always said, if you want to know what's going on in an organization, talk to the people doing the work on the front lines and try to make sure that not only information gets down to them, but their information gets up through the organization. And the other thing I've done, particularly in the government, is there's, particularly the IRS historically, appropriately, has been very careful about keeping within itself and not looking like it's providing favoritism to anyone. But again, my experience has been that there are a lot of opportunities for the government to have real transparent but real partnerships where you maximize the effort and the experience of the government and its employees and the private sector companies working in an area to achieve a common goal in a win-win situation. So I've had enough experience
and with
of
state
that.
and local officials too.
Yes, and state and local. I mean, as you can imagine, there are 44 states with income taxes, and there are 44 state tax commissioners, and getting them all together is a little like herding cats because they're all individual, representing sovereigns. But as you go forward, and again, I didn't require anybody to do anything, but as we went forward and we're making progress, more and more people would say, hey, listen, I want to join that group. I want to join that party. And so there are some lessons to be learned out there about how to navigate.
Needless to say, one of the big problems in our world are unwieldy, unaccountable bureaucracies, whether they're private or government. And it's almost a common language between the mayor of Moscow and the mayor of Sao Paulo or the mayor of New York City. They understand it. And there's a dearth of managerial skill and effectiveness coursing through these bureaucracies, and that's what makes people turn against government very often. So I think in any kind of book that you would write, John Koskinen, you would provide a huge service internationally, because a lot of your insights and a lot of your experience flow not just from your belief in public service, it flows from your special personality. Like one chapter in your book could be called How to Stay Cool Under Immense Pressure. They tried to rattle you in the Senate and the House. They wanted to impeach you, the Republicans. They didn't pay attention to the evidence that the IRS scrutinized liberal nonprofit groups as well as conservative nonprofit groups. And you never lost your temper. You tended to smile at times. You were unruffled. But you see, that's what you brought to your own work at the IRS and at other places that you've worked around the country. And so I really urge you to write this up. It's not in your fashion to be egotistical at all, but you can provide enormous education to people. It could be used in business schools and law schools and public administration courses. So that's my pitch. And let's get a question or two from Steve Scrovan or David Feldman.
Yes, I have a question. Assuming the Democrats take the House, how quickly could the House Oversight Committee get their hands on the president's tax returns? What's the process?
As a general matter, the only people who can get their hands on a tax return would be someone who was in the issue of a law enforcement proceeding. The Congress never asks for and never gets tax returns on any individual. Those are protected by statute.
What's this a situation where someone like Donald Trump can say that I'm under audit by the IRS and there's never an end to the audit? Obviously, the IRS does end audits. They don't, on an individual, they don't continually audit, do they, year after year after year after year?
No, audits do come to an end, but if you are, as you've noted earlier, a corporation with a lot of complications or even a wealthy individual with a lot of complicated issues, those issues may continue, so you may be under audit for a longer period of time, but it may not be a single audit. It may be a continuation or a new set of issues.
Is the IRS allowed to say whether or not the president's being audited? Isn't that the problem, that the IRS can't deny?
We have no ability to talk about anybody's status, anybody's return. So, for instance, I could not confirm to anybody, as you know, whether anybody's under audit.
So Trump can claim he's being audited when, in fact, he's not.
Any taxpayer can make any comment about his tax situation that he would like.
That's true.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening.
Stand up, you've been sitting